Hey folks, tonight we're diving into something a little less philosophical, but just as intriguing: the food served in Wild West saloons. Sure, these places were famous for whiskey, rowdy brawls, and questionable piano tunes. But what did people actually eat in them? Was it just beans and bacon, or were there surprises hidden behind those swinging doors? Before we settle in, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that ambient hum, and let's ease into tonight's topic together. The first thing you noticed when walking into a Wild West saloon wasn't the piano or the sound of someone losing at poker. It was the smell. Forget those romantic images of sizzling steak and fresh cornbread. The real aroma hit like a freight train, a thick mix of sweaty cowboys, stale tobacco, old beer, damp wood, and horses that hadn't seen soap in years. If you were lucky, you might detect a faint trace of food cooking somewhere in the back. Some saloons tried to cover it up with sawdust on the floor or clouds of pipe smoke thick enough to erase memories. Others simply leaned into it. "You don't come here for the air," barkeeps would joke, swatting flies away with a rag that hadn't been washed since the Civil War. Yet somehow, there was always a kitchen. It might have been a tiny hearth, with beans simmering over a low flame, or maybe a grumpy woman in a soot-covered apron stirring a stew with a spoon that doubled as protection. But somewhere, someone was cooking. And if you could smell it over the whiskey fumes and sweat, you were already halfway to a meal. If you could find a seat, that is. Most saloons didn't look anything like modern restaurants. No servers, no curated menus, just a few rough tables, some unstable chairs, and one long counter where you could eat, drink, argue, or do all three in one sitting. If you were a regular, the cook might yell, "Beans or stew?" and you'd answer without looking up. If you were new, they'd size you up, trying to figure out if you'd pay or pass out before your food arrived. That's what made saloon dining unique. It wasn't about flavor. It was about making it through. You ate what was available, sat beside strangers who might either rob you or save your life the next day, and if you got sick from the meal, well, that's what the whiskey was for. Beans were the cornerstone of Wild West cuisine, not because they were tasty, but because they were cheap, indestructible, and outlasted almost everything. Pinto, black, navy, it didn't matter. If it was dry and boilable, it landed in the pot. Beans were ever present in saloons, served morning, noon, and night, usually to men who hadn't seen a vegetable since leaving Kansas. The process was basic. Throw beans in a pot, boil them. Over a questionable fire for 6 hours, serve with salt pork and a dry biscuit, and add an apologetic look. Some cooks tried to elevate them with lard, onions, or a dash of chili powder if they were feeling creative. But most didn't bother. In the Wild West, flavor was a bonus, and seasoning was whatever blew through the window. Still, beans were dependable, filling, sturdy, and predictable. Qualities cowboys admired more than gold. They fueled cattle drives, powered poker games, and gave you something to chew while waiting for the piano player or the next fight. There was only one problem: the aftermath. One cowboy eating beans. Fine. 10 cowboys. That saloon turned into a gas chamber. Rumor has it some bar fights were less about insults and more about silent but deadly offenses by the stove. Even so, when meat ran low, chickens disappeared, or the cook was too drunk to function. The beans held strong, unburnt and unchanged. Some cowboys even preferred them cold, or as a kind of emergency trade item. Legend says a man once bartered a horse with 3 pounds of salted beans and a promise not to return. So yes, saloon food had its ups and downs, but beans were the foundation, the constant, the humble heartbeat of dusty meals. You didn't love them, but you respected them. And sometimes that was enough. If beans were the soul of saloon food, salt pork was its greasy backbone. A chunk of fatty meat tough enough to survive storms, fistfights, and months in a saddlebag. Salt pork wasn't bacon, though cowboys liked to pretend it was. It was pork belly, salted heavily and sometimes smoked, stored in barrels full of brine, strong enough to season a sea. Salt preserved it from spoiling, and maybe from being truly edible. Cooked well, it was passable. Fried crispy in a skillet, it had taste, grease, and that crunch that made you forget your dinner came from a can. Cooked poorly, which was often, it resembled a salty boot dipped in grease. Still, salt pork had loyal fans. It traveled well, was hard to mess up, though many did, and added a salty kick to even the blandest beans. Nothing went to waste, the fat-fried biscuits and potatoes, and the rind went into stews or to unlucky strangers who didn't know better. One bite, and they'd learn. Chew slow or choke proud, as the barkeep warned. Sure, some of it had a greenish hue or a questionable odor, but in saloons, the rule wasn't, is it fresh? It was, did it kill the last guy? If not, you gave it a go. Salt pork could be diced into beans, slapped on biscuits, fried solo, or gnawed like jerky. Cowboys treasured it, and cooks leaned on it when ingredients ran out. It wasn't fancy or nutritious, but if it kept you going 60 miles to the next meal, it had done its job. And if you lived through it, you were tougher for it. Stew was the great equalizer, hot, vaguely meaty, and consistently suspicious. Nearly every saloon had some version of it, regardless of how basic their kitchen was. Why? Because stew could disguise just about anything. It started with a pot, a fire, and whatever was left. Water, beans, maybe potatoes. Then toss in whatever. Hadn't escaped yet. Beef, rabbit, squirrel, even rattlesnake if it was no longer biting. One traveler claimed to find a bootstring in his bowl. He wasn't even mad. It was the easiest thing to chew. The meat ranged in quality. Some stews had decent cuts from local butchers. Others, you didn't ask. If the cook looked uneasy and the town's dog population had recently thinned out, you simply avoided the chewy bits. Vegetables, if there were any, were boiled into nothing. Carrots faded into orange smears. Onions vanished. Potatoes put up. The longest fight, but even they gave in. The end result was a grey-brown slurry that smelled better than it looked and tasted better than expected, assuming it was salted enough. Spices were a luxury. Most stews got their flavour from the cook's hands or the knife. If there was black pepper, you were somewhere upscale. Chili powder? Prepare to have your sinuses cleared the hard way. Still, stew was comfort food. It was warm, filling, and could be endlessly stretched by adding more water. One pot could feed a dozen or last 3 days, thickening each time until it had the consistency of glue with a personality. You didn't eat stew because it was good. You ate it because it was available, warm, and better than chewing tobacco. Or despair. Just don't ask what's in it. In the Wild West, not knowing was the safest option. Most cowboys couldn't afford steak, but almost every saloon had some form of bread to mop up their stew. Usually it came in 2 varieties, soft, flaky biscuits or hardtack, the undead version of bread. Let's start with the biscuits. When made well, which was rare but memorable, they were warm, buttery, and flaky enough to make a man think he was back in a real kitchen. Cooks who nailed biscuits became local legends. Some credited lard, others buttermilk, or maybe just dumb luck and low expectations. These biscuits accompanied beans or stew, soaking up the broth that didn't scald your mouth. Often cooked in cast iron over open flames, they came with a questionable lump of butter or a bit of molasses if the place was fancy. Then there was hardtack, just flour and water baked to outlast time. Originally made for soldiers and sailors, it ended up in saloons for one reason. It never spoiled. It also barely qualified as food. Eating hardtack took strategy. First, check for weevils, not a deal-breaker, just extra texture. Then soak it in stew, coffee, or whiskey until it softened. That might take 10 minutes, or a full administration, even. Soaked, chewing hardtack was an ordeal. You didn't just eat it, you battled it. Dentists likely earned a fortune fixing teeth cracked on this stuff. But both biscuits and hardtack had a purpose. They were cheap, portable, and filling. In a world where calories were currency, that was enough. So if you walked into a saloon and saw a plate of steaming biscuits, you counted your blessings. If you got a hardtack disc instead, well, at least you got a story. And maybe a chipped molar. If you think today's coffee is strong, wait until we get to Cowboy coffee. A brew so fierce it didn't just wake you up. It stared you down and dared you to blink. On top, it was ground coarsely, if at all, thrown into a kettle and boiled until it turned pitch black and borderline alive. The typical method was straightforward. Fetch water from whatever was nearby, hopefully not downstream from the horses. Toss. In a fistful of grounds, guided only by instinct and frustration, then boil it vigorously. No straining, no second guessing. Just pour and hope for the best. What you got was a thick, dark brew that smelled like scorched hopes and tasted like revenge. Often, the final sip had more grounds than liquid, offering cowboys both caffeine and a generous helping of fiber. And yet they swore by it. They swore. Coffee kept you warm in the chill of desert dawns, kept you awake during overnight watches, dulled hangovers, and helped move along questionably cooked stew. It was fuel, comfort, and mild punishment, all served in one battered cup. Not every saloon served coffee unless they had a functioning kitchen. But when they did, it arrived scorching hot, often stale, and strong enough to peel paint. One cowboy likened it to getting kicked by a mule, harsh, but strangely missed once gone. Those with access to sugar or canned milk might have softened it slightly, but most just grimaced and drank it down. If the pot had been reheated all day, the result was the most potent brew imaginable, thicker than tar and twice as bitter. Some cooks stretched their supply by reusing old grounds. This frugal approach created coffee that tasted like lost dreams. But it still counted. In the Wild West, coffee wasn't about enjoyment, it was about endurance. In the Wild West, meat wasn't just food, it was currency, status, and sometimes a challenge. If you could afford it, you might enter a saloon and order a steak. What arrived depended entirely on luck, timing, and whether the cook held a personal grudge. Steak, in theory, was a delicacy. In practice, it was often a dry, overcooked hunk of beef fried in lard until submission, served without even a sprig of garnish. If you asked for medium rare, the cook might just stare you down until you backed off. Fresh beef wasn't always available. More often, it wasn't. So saloons turned to substitutes: jerky, salted buffalo, the occasional venison, or wild boar if a hunter got lucky, meaning managed to shoot it and drag it back before the buzzards. In remote mining towns, things got even more creative. Squirrel stew, roasted rattlesnake, or jackrabbit with a dash of something resembling seasoning. If it had legs and wasn't tied to someone's horse, it was on the menu. Sometimes you got meat and were told nothing more, which was a polite cue to keep chewing and not ask questions. If you had to chew too long or noticed something whisker-like, you simply sipped your whiskey, nodded, and accepted your lot. Age was another gamble. Some cuts had been around long enough to develop reputations. Cooks sliced off questionable bits, smothered the rest in gravy, and called it well-aged. If the meat moved when poked, you were allowed a single raised eyebrow, nothing more. On good days, when the meat was fresh and the cook sober, you might luck into a real meal, a seared slab of beef topped with a fried egg, and maybe even a biscuit on the side. A plate worth surviving a gunfight for. But most of the time, you ate what was there and hoped it didn't fight back. Dessert wasn't a regular feature in Wild West saloons. It was more of a pleasant surprise, born of spare ingredients and a cook's rare moment of kindness. But if there was one reliable comfort, it was cornbread, made from cornmeal, water or milk, lard, and occasionally baking powder, if the cook remembered. Cornbread was the utility knife of frontier food. It could be baked, fried, or scooped into stew. On its own, it was dry and crumbly, slightly sweet, and best enjoyed fresh, which meant it rarely was. More often than not, what you got had been resting by the stove since dawn, hard as a miner's. Regrets enter molasses, a thick, dark syrup that transformed dry cornbread into something almost indulgent. It was cowboy frosting, outlaw drizzle, and the gambler's last joy before losing it all on a bad hand. Molasses was cheap, shelf-stable, and covered the floors of even the driest baked goods. If a saloon had it, you were in luck. If they warmed it first, you were practically fine dining. Some cooks took it further, pouring warm molasses over skillet-fried cornbread and adding a pinch of salt or spice. It wasn't cake, but it felt like it after days of jerky and hardtack. Cornbread with molasses was the default dessert, quick, affordable, satisfying. No icing, no frills, just gritty, gooey contentment. It reminded weary travelers that not everything in the West was trying to kill them. If you wandered into a saloon before noon, not bleeding and relatively clear-headed, you might be offered eggs or chicken. If so, you were either blessed or being set up. Fresh eggs were precious, nearly as rare and delicate as gold. Chickens were temperamental, often stolen or eaten by predators. If eggs were on hand, the saloon either kept chickens, had a reliable supplier, or smuggled them in from elsewhere. What kind of eggs? Ideally chicken, possibly duck, sometimes something else. You learned not to inquire. You asked for eggs, and what you got depended entirely on the cook's disposition and how long the eggs had been waiting. Some were scrambled to hide the color, others fried to the point of leather. If your egg wobbled when it landed, it was nature's way of saying, order whiskey. Chicken was technically an option. But if you ordered fried chicken, you'd likely receive a scrawny, bitter bird. Tough, bony and fried, until every last bit of flavor surrendered. Not always worth the effort to chew, but it was hot, it was meat, and it wasn't beans. That was enough for most. You might get a drumstick no larger than your thumb or a roasted quarter. You might also find a feather in your gravy. That was part of the deal. Eggs and chicken weren't just food, they were status. They said, "We serve," something that didn't come from a tin. If the eggs were warm and the chicken moist, you'd talk about that meal for weeks. If it left you with food poisoning, well, that was just the West reminding you of the rules. Ordering eggs meant something, the promise of morning, of survival, and maybe, just maybe, another chance to drink by sunset. In the Wild West, pie wasn't just dessert. It was a declaration. Spotting a pie on the bar, steam rising, golden crust glowing, and a whiff of apples cutting through the smoke meant this saloon cared. Someone in that kitchen had put in effort, which in a world of bean mush and dry pork was practically romance. But keep your expectations in check. Wild West pie wasn't a perfect pastry. It was rugged, uneven crusts, fillings from dried or canned fruit, and served lukewarm at best. Whipped cream? Not unless a cow followed you into town. Common types included apple, peach, or berry, which could mean anything vaguely fruit-like, including raisins. If the cook liked sugar, maybe you got cinnamon. If not, you got dough, sweetness, and hope. Still, pie was rare. Most cowboys hadn't tasted one since leaving home. Saloons knew pie was a draw. Offer a decent slice and you could pull customers from miles away. If the pie was warm and flaky, it might even cause a shootout. That's not exaggeration. There are accounts, some real, some embellished, of poker games ending in violence over pie. You took the last piece was just as valid a reason to brawl as cheating. In a land where men were stabbed over spilled whiskey, pie was sacred. Not all pies were good. Some were all crust, some were experimental, some contained fillings that may have once been fruit. But when conditions aligned, the cook sober, oven hot, fruit recognizable, that slice of pie became more than food. It was hope. Served on tin cheese in the Wild West was like poker, risky, uncertain, and often followed by regret. Yes, it existed, but finding it took effort and bravery. Cheese wasn't shipped in tidy wheels. It was usually homemade, crafted by someone with vague memories of a dairy recipe. Saloon cheese came in two varieties, hard and oddly shiny, or soft, crumbly, and alarmingly fragrant. Refrigeration was rare, so unless it was a cold month or stored in a cave, your cheese probably had an character. It might have been cheddar, it might have been something else entirely, dusted with salt and crossed fingers. If it squeaked when bitten, that was your business. Cheese was typically served in chunks with bread, jerky, or, if fortune smiled, a pickle. It added protein, broke the monotony, and gave cowboys something to chew between fistfights. Sometimes it was melted on beans or toasted into cornbread, assuming the cook felt inspired. But caution was warranted. Some saloons cut corners. What passed as cheese might be old butter, curdled milk, or a salty mystery rolled in pepper to throw you off. One traveler claimed he bought cheese in Nevada that tasted like boiled socks, but still finished it, because bad cheese was still cheese. Any saloon offering cheese stood out. It meant the owner had a farm connection, or access to a cow. No one had stolen yet. Cheese wasn't about flavor, it was a signal, a sign of civilization, however faint, in a land where many still bathed in sand. So if your plate came with cheese, you poked it, sniffed it, maybe tapped it once, and ate it anyway. Because in the Wild West, every meal was a gamble, and cheese, that was just part of the odds. There are stories, possibly exaggerated, of men biting into pickled sausages only to find bones, or a label that simply said, maybe pork. Still, pickled foods were part of life in the Wild West, salty, sour, and strangely satisfying. Like most things that endured out there, they weren't eaten for pleasure. They were eaten because they probably wouldn't kill you. When supplies were low, the kitchen was shut, or the stew looked like it might still be breathing. Cowboys and drifters turned to the one reliable item on the saloon menu: whiskey. It was always in stock, required no preparation, and if you drank enough of it, you forgot you were hungry, or that you'd just eaten something that might have been squirrel. Whiskey in the Wild West wasn't aged in oak barrels or hand-picked by connoisseurs. It was raw, rough, and sometimes risky. Made from corn, rye, or whatever the barkeep had on hand, it was distilled in barns, bathtubs, and backrooms. The result? A drink that could clean wounds, strip paint, and ignite bar fights. Some called it rotgut, others chain lightning. A few just called it lunch. When the beans were burnt and the bread was moldy, men drank their calories, one fiery shot at a time. Saloon whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a survival tool. It dulled the pain of trail dust, heartbreak, broken ribs, and questionable stew. One shot before a duel, 2 shots after, and maybe a few more while waiting to see how serious the bullet wound was. Many saloons offered whiskey specials that came with a biscuit or some beans, not for taste, but to keep you on your feet. Some drank whiskey with a pickled egg floating in it, which somehow passed for both hydration and protein. Whiskey was also social glue. You bought it to make friends, start fights, and sometimes to apologize after both. A saloon's reputation was often judged by how quickly its whiskey knocked a man off his stool. As for quality, best not to ask. Some of it was barely disguised moonshine, with additives ranging from tobacco juice to cayenne pepper. It burned, going down, and if it didn't, you might have been drinking kerosene. Still, no one complained because whiskey was warm, cheap, and honest. The one item on the menu that never pretended to be anything else. On nights when your dinner came in a glass, with no fork and no questions, you simply raised it and called it a meal. In any saloon that dared serve food, there was always a smoke-covered figure whose authority rivaled the bartender, sheriff, and preacher combined, the cook. This person, usually unshaven and always short-tempered, was either a culinary savior or a disaster in an apron. There was no in-between. You'd rarely see them smile, but you'd remember their cooking for days, either in gratitude or through digestive distress. Saloon cooks weren't trained professionals. They were often ex-miners, ex-convicts, or ex-somethings who knew how to light a fire and weren't squeamish about odd cuts of meat. Their kitchen consisted of a fire pit, a dented stove, and one cast-iron pan that hadn't seen soap since the gold rush. And somehow, they managed to feed entire saloons. On a good day, they produced chili so rich it could bring a tear to your eye. The biscuits were warm, the beans fully cooked, and the cornbread sweet enough to stir memories of home. On a bad day, the beans were burnt, the meat was grey, and the stew had an oily sheen that moved even when the pot didn't. But you didn't complain. You couldn't. Saloon etiquette made one thing clear: never insult the cook. The cook controlled everything: the salt, the grease, and the ratio of mystery meat. If they liked you, you got the best cut. If not, you got the bottom scrapings of last night's mistake, reheated and renamed chili. Many cooks also doubled as unofficial bouncers. No one wanted to get smacked with a ladle that had just fried. Salt pork. If they had a cleaver, and many did, they could clear a room faster than a shotgun. Despite their moods, these cooks were essential. They kept cowboys upright, miners from fainting, and travelers from collapsing mid-sentence. They worked long hours amid heat and smoke, endured criticism about their seasoning, and lived by one rule: if you don't like it, there's the door, or the whiskey. So whether they were your hero or your hazard, you always nodded respectfully to the cook. Because in the Wild West, they held your stomach and your fate in their greasy, glorious hands. Now that we've walked through the swinging doors, smelled the stew, and stared down a pickled egg in a cloudy jar, the question remains: would you actually eat Wild West saloon food? Let's be honest, modern taste buds might not stand a chance. The beans were plain, the meat was a gamble, and the stew was more puzzle than meal. You'd need tough teeth, a tougher stomach, and the kind of hunger that comes from riding 40 miles on a sun-scorched horse. But here's the thing: for the cowboys, miners, gamblers, and misfits of the frontier, saloon food wasn't about flavor or presentation. It was about fuel, calories, heat, and a hot plate between gunfights, train heists, or nights spent sleeping in barns beside mules named Regret. It was about survival. You didn't ask where the meat came from. You didn't whine if the biscuit crumbled like chalk. You just ate what was given and washed it down with something strong enough to kill bacteria or your sense of taste. And when the food was good, when the beans were fresh, the coffee didn't fight back, and the cornbread had a touch of molasses, it felt like a small miracle. So would you eat it if you lived back then? Absolutely. You wouldn't just eat it, you'd be thankful. You'd scrape the bowl, wipe the plate with crusty bread, and order seconds with coins that still smelled like dynamite and horse sweat. You'd laugh with strangers, curse the cook, toast with whiskey, and maybe, just maybe, end the night with pie and a story worth retelling, because saloon food wasn't fancy. It was greasy, gritty, and real. And in a world where the West was still wild, that was more than enough. Long before tattoos adorned biceps and backs in trendy studios, they held a far older place in human history, etched not for style, but for meaning, mystery, and survival. Let's go back to a time before cities, before gods had names, when humans lived close to the bone, in body and spirit. Enter the Iceman. Discovered in 1991, frozen in a glacier between Austria and Italy, his mummified body was over 5,000 years old, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. And across his leathery skin, researchers found something surprisingly familiar: tattoos. 61 of them, to be exact. Not spirals or animals, but dark carbon marks, dots and lines along his spine, knees, and ankles. What's fascinating is that the locations of Ötzi's tattoos correspond to known acupuncture points. Was this ancient pain relief? a healing ritual, or something more spiritual, an endurance rite carved into the skin? We may never know for sure, but one thing's certain, even in the Stone Age, humans marked their bodies with intention, and Otzi wasn't alone. In ancient Egypt, tattoos appeared mainly on women, priestesses and dancers. These weren't decorative butterflies or ex-lover names. They were symbolic patterns placed around the abdomen, chest and thighs. Some scholars believe they served to protect women during childbirth, channel fertility, or ward off evil, spiritual shields inked directly onto the body. Further south, in Nubia, archaeologists uncovered mummies bearing tattoos of animals, bulls, crocodiles, symbols of strength and survival. Across early societies, tattoos weren't rebellion. They were reverence. Not about fashion, but about faith, permanence, and meaning carried in pain. So next time you spot an inked arm at the gym or subway, remember, this tradition didn't begin in a studio. It began in ice, in sand, in the silent depths of forgotten millennia. If you think tattoos are just edgy trends or signs of rebellion, try saying that to a Polynesian chief and watch the air go still. In Polynesian culture, tattoos weren't optional or decorative. They were sacred. In fact, the word tattoo itself comes from the Tahitian word tatau, meaning to strike. And that's exactly how it started, with bone tools dipped in soot, tapped rhythmically into the skin with a stick. Each strike echoed generations of tradition. In places like Samoa, Tonga, and especially among the Maori of New Zealand, tattoos weren't just art, they were identity. A person's moko, the intricate facial tattoos of the Maori, told you everything: their status, family, ancestry, and personal accomplishments. The face wasn't just a surface, it was a living document. To remove it was to erase a life. Young men often received their first tattoos through painful initiation ceremonies. This wasn't a late-night whim after a few drinks. It was a spiritual transformation. The process was agonizing. No anesthetics, no numbing cream, just bravery and a shared belief in the deeper meaning behind the pain. Women were tattooed too, on the lips, chins, and thighs. These weren't vanity marks, but symbols of grace, maturity, and sacred energy, believed to connect all life. A woman without tattoos was sometimes seen as unfinished, as a canvas still blank in a world full of stories. But then came colonialism. Missionaries brought scissors, soap, and judgment. They saw tattoos as pagan, primitive, and unchristian. In some regions, traditional tattooing was banned, forcing it underground, spoken in hushed tones like a forbidden language. Still, the Dao ink endured. Today, many Polynesians are proudly reclaiming their tattoo heritage. The ancient tools have returned, the sacred designs reappeared, and across the Pacific, you can once again hear the sound of tatau, not just as an art form, but as a living tradition. But as a form of cultural survival, these weren't just marks on the skin. They were, and still are, declarations of spirit, lineage, and identity. Step into the world of warriors, slaves, and thinkers, and you might not expect to find tattoos. After all, when we think of ancient Greece and Rome, we picture marble statues and smooth, idealized bodies. But if we look past the myth, ink appears. In the margins, in ancient Greece, tattoos were first linked to slaves and criminals. The word stigma, which gives us stigmatize, referred to permanent marks burned or inked into the skin as punishment. These weren't decorative, they were warnings. A runaway slave or captive might be tattooed on the forehead with a phrase like, "Stop me, I ran away." A literal scarlet letter etched into the flesh. The Romans, ever pragmatic, adopted this idea and expanded it. Soldiers in elite Roman legions were sometimes tattooed as a sign of allegiance, a kind of permanent dog tag. But tattoos also branded gladiators, enslaved people, and prisoners of war. These marks weren't about personal identity, but ownership. There's a darker layer to this history. Early Christians under Roman persecution were sometimes tattooed to humiliate them. Yet centuries later, Christians would reclaim tattoos. Pilgrims to Jerusalem during the Middle Ages would often return with tiny crosses tattooed on their arms, proof of devotion and the hardships they endured. What started as punishment became a symbol of belief. Later, under Emperor Constantine, the same ruler who legalized Christianity, tattooing on the face was banned. Not out of mercy, but because the face, he argued, was created in God's image and shouldn't be defiled. The rest of the body, however, was still marked freely. Unlike Polynesian cultures, where tattoos were signs of social honor, in Greece and Rome they typically degraded status. Tattoos labeled someone as an outsider, a sinner or property, but even so they told a story, sometimes against your will, but always part of you. In these empires built on law, conquest, and spectacle, tattoos were less about personal expression and more about control, punishment, and power. And like many forms of oppression, they were eventually reclaimed. While Western societies used tattoos to brand criminals and the enslaved, Eastern cultures often took a more symbolic and spiritual approach. In these regions, body art could represent both protection and paradox. Let's begin in India. Though known today for mehendi, the temporary henna used in festivals and weddings, India also has a long tradition of permanent tattooing. Among tribal groups like the Baiga, Gond and Santhal, tattoos were seen as both decoration and defense. Women were tattooed with symbols of fertility, strength and faith, not randomly but through customs passed down generations. These tattoos weren't just for aesthetics. They were considered spiritual jewelry, impossible to steal and enduring through poverty. In Japan, the story is more complex. In early periods, tattoos may have had sacred meaning, possibly used to signal status or repel evil, but by the Edo era, tattoos took on a harsher tone. They became tools of punishment, criminals tattooed with symbols that revealed their crimes and hometowns. Imagine entering a village where everyone could read your guilt directly from your skin. Yet out of this harsh reality, a subculture emerged. Marginalized groups, firefighters, laborers, and eventually the Yakuza embraced tattoos as marks of pride. They developed full-body artworks called irizumi, with dragons, tigers, and mythical figures. These complex designs took hundreds of painful hours to complete. Each one carried a personal myth, inked beneath the weight of society's judgment. In Southeast Asia, Buddhist monks practiced sakyant tattoos, sacred geometric patterns paired with Pali script. These designs, believed to offer strength, protection, and blessings, were applied with sharp bamboo or steel rods, always accompanied by ritual chants. In the East, tattoos could be sacred or forbidden, pure or criminal. It depended on the wearer and the intent, but one truth remained constant. In these cultures, skin was never silent. It spoke through symbols of power, punishment, prayer, and identity. As the Roman Empire collapsed and Christianity took hold in the West, tattooing began to fade. Why? Because the body, once a canvas for expression or branding, was now viewed by the church as a sacred temple, and temples, it was believed, should remain unmarked. The early Christian stance on tattoos was complicated. On one hand, small groups adopted them as signs of devotion. Pilgrims to Jerusalem would tattoo crosses on their wrists as permanent reminders of their journey. These were badges of endurance, symbols of having made the sacred trek and survived. But these practices were rare. By the Middle Ages, the dominant church message was clear. Tattooing was pagan, and paganism was sinful. Leviticus 19:28 was frequently cited. "You shall not make any cuts in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks upon you. I am the Lord." That single verse buried an entire art form for centuries. Across Europe, tattoos became associated with sorcery, heresy, and devil worship. During the Inquisition, tattooing all but disappeared, surviving only in whispers and distant corners of the Christian world. Still, the tradition never completely died. In the Byzantine Empire, some Christian groups continued the practice, tattooing small crosses on their hands to guard against enslavement. Ethiopian Coptic Christians also kept tattoo customs alive, using them in sacred rituals. Even crusaders quietly revived tattooing, etching crosses on their skin, not only for spiritual protection, but so they'd be buried as Christians if they fell in battle. So, while medieval Europe tried to erase tattooing, it survived. Hidden in remote monasteries, pilgrim routes and desert sanctuaries, waiting quietly for its return. That return came with the age of exploration. As wooden ships crossed uncharted seas, tattoos found new surfaces, sailors. These weren't artisans or priests. They were weathered men, shaped by wind and waves, who began tattooing anchors, mermaids, and crucifixes onto their skin. Tattoos re-entered European consciousness thanks largely to the 18th century voyages of Captain James Cook. When his crew reached Polynesia, they encountered entire societies adorned in ink. Fascinated, many sailors got tattooed themselves, both to respect local traditions and to boast that they'd been somewhere far from home. Back at port, these tattoos became status symbols, evidence of distant voyages and daring adventures. Before long, tattoos became the unofficial badge of sailors, but they weren't just fashion statements. They were filled with meaning. An anchor represented stability, a pig or rooster on the feet, animals kept in floating crates, were thought to prevent drowning. Hold fast, tattooed across knuckles, symbolized strength to cling to rigging. During storms, religious symbols were common too, crosses on the back, the Virgin Mary over the heart, each meant to offer divine protection. As tattooed sailors returned to Europe and America, the practice spread not to royalty, but to the working class. Dockhands, soldiers, and convicts adopted tattoos as marks of toughness and survival. During the American Civil War, soldiers sometimes tattooed their names and units on their arms, a grim safeguard in case they died and needed to be identified. While the elite rejected tattoos, those who mapped the world embraced them. For these men, every design told a story, a battle, a journey, a prayer. And when the world ended in cannon fire or crashing waves, it might be the only thing that proved they had lived. By the 19th and 20th centuries, tattoos had moved far from temples and tribal ceremonies. In many places they became signs of rebellion, especially in prisons. Behind bars, tattoos formed a secret language, etched with makeshift tools and coded meaning. In the Soviet Union's prison camps, a powerful tattoo culture emerged. These designs weren't for decoration, they were maps of status and defiance. Stars on the shoulders signified authority. Barbed wire on the neck meant life without parole. Cathedral domes on the chest, each dome was a prison term served. But these symbols had strict rules. Wearing an unearned mark could mean having it cut off, violently. In Japan, the Yakuza turned Irizumi into a symbol of brotherhood. Tattoos of dragons, koi fish and warriors covered the body, usually hidden beneath suits. These weren't just displays of rebellion. They were proof of loyalty, pain, and commitment. In the West, prison tattoos developed their own vocabulary. A teardrop might indicate murder or grief. Cobwebs on the elbows could mean years spent behind bars. Dots, numbers, and acronyms signaled affiliations and histories, readable only to those who understood the code. The tools were crude. Sewing. Needles, paper clips, and melted ink, but the symbols carried weight. These tattoos weren't about art. They were about survival and more about identity. A proof that you belonged, or a warning that you didn't. Outside prison walls, these tattoos carried a harsh stigma. They branded you as dangerous, untouchable, beyond saving. But for those who wore them, that ink was often the only stable part of themselves, the only thing they truly owned in a system designed to take everything else away. In prison, tattoos weren't about fashion. They were about survival. By the 20th century, tattoos had shifted from sacred signs and outlaw markers to emblems of mainstream rebellion. Where the church once condemned them as signs of sin, society began to see tattoos as symbols of freedom and at times of a certain edgy appeal. In the early 1900s, tattooed performers still featured in circus sideshows, tattooed ladies and illustrated men who charged admission to reveal their fully inked bodies. People stared, gasped. It was taboo, cloaked in spectacle, but change was coming. By mid-century, World War II soldiers returned with modest tattoos, anchors, eagles, hearts with "Mom" etched in scrolls. These weren't for display. They were mementos of pain, loyalty, and survival. They told stories of what had been endured and who had been lost. Then came the 1960s and 70s counterculture. Tattoos broke free from their working-class origins and showed up on rock stars, bikers, and poets. Janis Joplin wore a tattooed bracelet. The Hells Angels displayed their ink like armor. Getting a tattoo, still frowned upon by polite society, became an act of defiance. A statement, "I don't care what you think." Tattoo parlors, once hidden in back alleys, began going legit. Artists like Lyle Tuttle, who famously tattooed Cher and the Rolling Stones, helped elevate the form. The tattoo gun became a brush. Ink wasn't just a symbol, it was personal, political, and powerful. Still, the stigma lingered. Even into the 1990s and early 2000s, visible tattoos could prevent you from getting hired. Many job applications explicitly stated, "No visible ink." Tattoos still suggested criminality, rebellion, or irresponsibility, especially for women who faced even harsher judgment. But momentum was building. Tattoo-focused TV shows appeared. Celebrities flaunted full sleeves. Conventions became common. Tattooing moved from fringe subculture into the heart of pop culture. From rebellion to runway, tattoos re-entered the mainstream, but never lost their roots. In an age where everything from our voices to our memories lives in the cloud, you might expect tattoos, so physical, so permanent, to fade away. Instead, they've flourished. Tattoos haven't just survived the digital era, they've evolved with it. Today, tattoos are more than ink and skin. They're powered by apps, augmented by technology, and sometimes designed by machines that would leave 19th century sailors in awe. Some artists now use AI to produce ultra-detailed designs. Others employ machines that apply ink with surgical precision. Then there are smart tattoos, experimental patches equipped with sensors that track vitals, control devices, or even light up using LED ink. It sounds like science fiction, but these are already being tested in labs. Even without the high-tech upgrades, tattoo culture is booming. What was once taboo is now embraced across professions, identities, and cultures. Doctors have full sleeves. Teachers wear visible wristbands of ink. CEOs step into boardrooms with elaborate backpieces hidden beneath tailored suits. Social media has democratized the craft. A tattoo in Seoul can go viral in Seattle. Artists now grow international audiences overnight, and clients book appointments with a tap on their phones, and the meaning, if anything, it's grown deeper. People now ink the sound waves of loved ones' voices, the coordinates of where they met, their partners, portraits of their pets, constellations from the night their child was born. They choose quotes in forgotten languages, etched in skin to remember, to heal, to belong. Cultural tattooing is experiencing a revival too. Indigenous communities from the Arctic to the Andes are reclaiming ancestral designs, asserting identity, and through ink. What was once suppressed is now worn with pride, a living act of remembrance. Debates still linger. Is it art or trend, sacred or superficial? Can your story truly be yours if it's filtered through algorithms and social approval? But perhaps that's exactly the space tattoos have always lived in, that murky zone between pain and beauty, permanence and transformation. Tattoos are both primal and futuristic, a whisper from the past, a vision for tomorrow. And as long as humans search for meaning, memory, and a mark to prove they lived, tattoos will remain. Ink will always speak, even when words cannot. Before empires clashed and blood soaked the ground, before kings trembled at her name, Tomyris was simply a daughter of the wind, raised on the open steppe. Her homeland wasn't adorned with marble or echoing with philosophy. It was raw, fierce, and vast. This was the domain of the Massagete, nomadic horse archers who rode like shadows. Their lives were shaped by survival, honor, and war. Little is known about Tomyris's childhood, but we can imagine the rhythm of it. She likely rode before she could walk, learned to shoot before speaking in full sentences. In her world, girls weren't confined or silenced. They trained alongside boys, rode into battle, and carried iron in their veins. To lead, one had to bleed, and Tomyris did. Her tribe worshipped sun and sky, lived off herds, and buried their dead with weapons, ready for battle beyond this life. They had no cities, no palaces, but they had pride. When enemies approached, they answered not with prayers but with arrows. Tomyris likely assumed power after her husband's death. He may have led the tribe before her. But when her moment came, she didn't merely inherit command. She seized it. In an era when women were property, Tomyris led an army. She negotiated with kings. She spoke as an equal, and if they didn't listen, she made them. She wasn't just a queen. She was Shahut, the steppe's checkmate. A war chief in bronze and leather, ready to confront the mightiest empire on earth. But power, especially for a woman, never comes without cost. As Tomyris consolidated her rule, whispers began spreading. South of the mountains, a king was watching. His name was Cyrus the Great, and he wanted more. The stage was set, the wind swept the steppe. And Tomyris, daughter of warriors, stood on the edge of legend. While Tomyris ruled the plains, a different kind of power was growing to the south, structured, expansive, unstoppable. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, had already conquered Lydia and Babylon. His banners stretched across deserts, mountains, and cities, but he wasn't done. Empire building demands constant expansion. And now his sights turned to the northeast. To Cyrus, the Massagete were both threat and opportunity. They held no great wealth or cities, but they controlled vital trade routes and resources. More importantly, they had something empires couldn't: ignore pride. And in Cyrus's view, pride could be bent or broken, but he didn't start with war. Known for his cleverness, Cyrus preferred diplomacy and trickery, so he proposed a royal marriage. According to ancient sources, especially Herodotus, Cyrus sent envoys offering an alliance through matrimony. On paper, it was ideal, the Persian king and the Massagete queen united. But Tomyris saw through it. This wasn't love. It was an attempt to absorb her people without resistance. She refused. That rejection didn't sit well in Persepolis. With diplomacy failed, Cyrus turned to his preferred language, war. He ordered his forces across the Araxes River, the natural divide between Persia and the Massagete. He would take what Tomyris wouldn't give. But Tomyris was already preparing. She knew the land. She knew her people's tactics, fast, precise, deadly on horseback. And she understood this wasn't just about territory. Cyrus wanted to crush a woman who had dared to say no. The most powerful king in the world had declared war. He had no idea what fury he'd awakened. Cyrus, brilliant tactician and veteran conqueror, believed he could outmaneuver her. He'd faced kings, toppled cities, ruled nations. To him, the Massagetes were wild nomads with horses and no walls. He didn't realize he was walking into the path of someone equally cunning and far more enraged. Tomyris had warned him. After refusing his proposal, she sent a clear message: cross the Araxes and you'll regret it. Cyrus crossed anyway. He built a bridge of boats to ferry his army into Massagete territory. But Tomyris didn't meet him head-on. Instead, she pulled her forces back, luring the Persians deeper into unfamiliar ground. They found an abandoned camp, stocked with food, and more importantly, wine. A luxury the nomadic Massagetes rarely enjoyed. It was bait, and Cyrus took it. He left part of his army in the camp under General Harpagus. As night fell, the Massagetes returned. The Persians, drunk and unaware, were caught off guard. The slaughter was swift. Among the dead was Spargapises, Tomyris' son, a commander. Accounts vary. Some say he was captured and chose to end his life in shame. Others claim he died in battle. But all agree. When word reached Tomyris, something inside her broke and then hardened. Her grief was profound, but her fury, that became legend. She sent one more message to Cyrus, this time not a warning, a promise. "You may be a glutton for blood," she said, "but I swear I will give you your fill." It wasn't just a threat, it was a vow. She promised to stain the earth with Persian blood. Her vengeance would not rest. Cyrus had taken her son. He had trespassed on her land. Now he would face not the queen of the Massagetes, but a grieving mother, one determined to make him pay. The next clash wouldn't be a battle, it would be a reckoning. As dawn broke across the plains, the sun glinted like a drawn blade, sharp and merciless. Tomyris stood at the front of her army, no longer just a sovereign, but the embodiment of a coming storm. Her warriors, shaped by the harsh nomadic life, smeared their faces with ash and wrath. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about justice. Cyrus, for all his legendary strength, had underestimated the Massagetes. He assumed they would fight like the other tribes he'd defeated, disorganized and easy to overwhelm. But Tomyris had been raised among fighters. She knew how to strike, not wildly, but with deliberate force. She rallied her army for a full assault on the Persian invaders. This time, she held nothing back. The precise site of the final confrontation is unknown, lost to the vastness of the steppe. What is clear is that Tomyris launched a devastating counter-offensive. Her cavalry surged like a tide of blades across the grasslands, shooting arrows from horseback, closing in with axes, fighting with the ferocity of those who had nothing left. The Persian forces, disciplined and seasoned though they were caught off guard by the scale and coordination of the attack. Tomyris didn't just command from afar, she fought alongside her soldiers. Her presence on the battlefield was electric. Each blow they struck was fueled by grief. Each charge echoed with the pain of her son's death. Cyrus tried to maintain control, but his forces crumbled. Many Persians died where they stood. Others fled, only to be hunted down in the grasslands, and Cyrus the Great, the man who had conquered Babylon, Lydia, and most of the known world, fell. Some say he died in battle, others claim he was captured and executed. Either way, he met his end on Tomyris' terms. What followed became legend. According to Herodotus, Tomyris found Cyrus's body, ordered his head severed, and in a symbolic act of retribution, dropped it into a wineskin filled with blood. "Drink your fill," she told him, "of the blood you longed for." Whether this was fact or literary embellishment doesn't really matter. The message was timeless. Tomyris would not be conquered. When the battle ended and the ground soaked up the blood of empire, Tomyris stood triumphant, a warrior queen who had accomplished what no king had managed. She had brought down Cyrus. The great news of the defeat sent tremors through the ancient world. The once invincible Achaemenid Empire had been humbled by a queen from the steppes. The Persians tried to minimize the loss, but the death of their founder couldn't be ignored. Cyrus's remains were eventually returned and buried with dignity in the royal tomb at Pasargadae. Still, his final defeat would stain the empire's legacy. For Tomyris and the Massagetei, this wasn't just about revenge, it was about sovereignty. They had defended their land not just with weapons, but with resolve. Tomyris had faced the world's most powerful ruler, and not only survived, but prevailed. And then she disappeared from the historical record. No texts describe her final years, her death, or any heirs she may have appointed. It was as if, having exacted her justice, she vanished into the horizon, letting her legend carry forward. In the centuries that followed, historians, poets, and storytellers tried to fill the gaps, turning her into a symbol as much as a person. To the Persians, her name remained a bitter memory. To the Greeks, she was a contradiction, a so-called barbarian with a nobler spirit than many kings. In Central Asia, Tomyris became folklore, a spectral queen who rode across the steppe, fierce and unyielding, her sword always drawn. Her story was depicted in countless ways. Medieval manuscripts portrayed her in ornate armor. Renaissance painters imagined her standing tall over Cyrus's lifeless body. With each generation, she became what the times needed, an avenging mother, a wild sovereign, a cautionary tale, or an icon of feminine power. But one truth cut through all the retellings: she changed history. Tomyris didn't inherit her power. She forged it with fire and determination. For one unforgettable moment, the Queen of the Steppe reminded the world that empires don't just rise, they can fall, trampled by riders driven by vengeance. Our understanding of Tomyris doesn't come from the Massagetei themselves. They left behind no archives, no carvings, no royal records. It comes from the writings of a Greek, Herodotus, often called the father of history. Writing a century after her time, he immortalized Tomyris as a queen of unwavering will and fearsome retribution. But Herodotus wasn't just reporting events. He was telling a story, part chronicle, part lesson. To him and his Greek readers, Tomyris symbolized the downfall of arrogance. Cyrus, the man who had conquered half the known world, wasn't undone by a rival king or massive empire, but by a mother seeking justice. Her victory had the air of legend, and Herodotus treated it accordingly. He described the gruesome revenge, the wineskin of blood, and her brutal words, "Drink your fill." But was it all true? Historians continue to debate that. Some believe Herodotus exaggerated or fabricated elements, using Tomyris as a moral counter to Persian pride. Others argue that while the blood-filled wineskin may be symbolic, Cyrus's death at her hands likely happened. There's also the question of perspective. Herodotus, despite his efforts at accuracy, saw the world through a Greek lens. He described the Massagetei as wild yet virtuous, an exotic contrast to Greek ideals. In his narrative, Tomyris wasn't just a foreign queen, she was a moral answer to imperial overreach. Even if the details blurred over time, Herodotus achieved something remarkable. He ensured Tomyris wouldn't be forgotten. Through his writing, she became more than a name. She became legend. And in that hazy space between myth and history, her story found a strange kind of permanence. In a world ruled by kings, Herodotus left us with a queen who refused to kneel, and left her enemies broken in the dust, though she brought down one. Of history's most famous emperors, Tomyris never built an empire of her own. She didn't construct cities or issue golden decrees. Her people, the Massagetei, were nomads, living not behind walls, but in rhythm with land, sky, and horse. Her legacy, therefore, was never captured in monuments. There were no marble statues, no coins bearing her face. Instead, her story lived on as stories do, around fires, in songs, in the awe of warriors. The Masajte were part of a larger network of Central Asian tribes, like the Scythians, the Saka, and the Dahai, all skilled in horseback archery, and fiercely independent. Female leaders among them were rare, but not unheard of. Steppe societies gave women more freedom than many settled civilizations. Women rode, hunted, fought, and sometimes led. Archaeologists have unearthed graves of women buried with weapons, armor, and horse gear, confirming that these warrior queens were more than just legends. Tomyris was the pinnacle of this tradition. Her power didn't come from divine right or inheritance. It came from competence. She unified scattered clans, led armies, and commanded respect. In a land where survival meant riding hard, shooting straight, and fearing nothing, she was the embodiment of strength. Yet because the Masajte left no records, Tomyris became a kind of phantom queen, known only through outsiders' accounts and the oral traditions of the steppe. To Persian scribes, she was a warning. To the Greeks, a marvel. To her people, she was likely remembered in bloodlines and battle cries, a spirit that rode with them across the grasslands. Empires may rise and fall in stone, but the stories of the steppe ride the wind. Tomyris, fierce, grieving, and undefeated, became that wind's voice. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Cyrus's descendants built Persepolis, faced Alexander the Great, and eventually faded into history's footnotes. But her legend remained, not in palaces or archives, but in the hearts of those who refused to bow. Across Central Asia, she became more than a queen. She became a symbol, a reminder of female strength, of resistance, of the untamed spirit of the steppe. She wasn't Roman, she wasn't Greek, she wasn't Persian. Her story belonged to no empire, and that made it both dangerous and inspiring. In the medieval Islamic world, chroniclers occasionally mentioned her, her name altered by language, but never erased. Some praised her justice, others called her savage, a cautionary tale of a woman's power unbound. By the Renaissance, European artists rediscovered her through Herodotus. They painted her in shining armor, standing over Cyrus's corpse. In one dramatic depiction, she holds his severed head high, soaked in blood. The image was theatrical, but also political, celebrating a woman who didn't merely survive a man's world, but conquered it. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Tomyris was adopted as a nationalist icon across Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Educators and poets embraced her as proof that the roots of Central Asian identity were proud, fierce, and feminine. Her name appeared in textbooks, monuments, and even military ceremonies. The queen who once ruled from horseback now rode again, through memory and pride. In a world still grappling with powerful women, Tomyris remains a challenge. She wasn't flawless or tame. She was firm, ruthless when needed, and merciful only when earned. She was resistance made flesh. And the blood of empire on her hands was a crown she bore without remorse. History often favors the builders of monuments, the authors of laws, the kings who inscribed their names in stone. Tamias did none of these. She left behind no empire, no palace to uncover, no royal seal to decode. Yet her name endures, not because she ruled forever, but because she refused to be forgotten. She challenges the usual way history remembers women, not as assistants or mere footnotes, but as forces of destiny. Tamias did not ask for recognition. She claimed it through blood and fire. She did not follow a king. She fought against one, and won. Her story is taught from Central Asia to Europe, not just because she defeated Cyrus the Great, but because she dared to oppose him. She was not protecting an empire, but defending freedom, a freedom that rode on horses, hunted with hawks, and slept beneath the stars, a freedom that cannot be confined to borders. Today, her statues rise in Kazakhstan's capital, Her face appears on coins and in textbooks. To modern Central Asians, she is a mother of nations, a connection to a pre-Islamic, pre-Soviet, proudly nomadic past, a reminder that their identity was forged not in submission, but in the battle cry and the thunder of hooves. In a world still divided by power, gender, and memory, Tamias is a symbol, not only because she killed a great king, but because she showed us something greater. Dignity is not given, it is taken. Leadership can look like a mother mourning her son and refusing to let his killer go unpunished. We often question why some names survive while others disappear. Tamias survived because she was unforgettable. At a time when women were expected to fade into men's tents, she rose, blade in hand, fury in heart, and carved her story into history's very flesh. Empires fall, statues crumble, but legends endure. Somewhere in the whispering winds of the steppe, the queen still rides, unbroken, undefeated, and impossible to forget. Long before encryption keys and surveillance cameras, there was a simpler concern: how to protect possessions from curious neighbors, roaming animals, and opportunistic thieves. As humans shifted from nomadic groups to settled civilizations, belongings multiplied, bringing new problems: envy, theft, and the urgent need for security. The instinct to guard what we value is ancient and primal. Even when food, tools, or sacred objects were stored in permanent places, a way had to be found to keep others out. But how can you protect something when you cannot watch it constantly? The answer was to create a mechanism that would guard it for you. The earliest known mechanical security device dates back about 4,000 years to ancient Egypt. What is remarkable is not just that locks existed then, but that the principle behind them still shapes locks today. The Egyptian wooden pin lock was an early engineering marvel. It used a wooden bolt with a series of holes and wooden pegs. When the correct key, often a large wooden tool with matching pins, was inserted, the pegs were lifted, allowing the bolt to slide open. Removing the key let gravity drop the pins back into place, locking the door. These locks were not just novelties. They secured storage rooms, tombs, and temple gates. Usually installed vertically inside doors to resist tampering, they might seem primitive today, but their design was brilliantly logical. They were puzzles, challenging any uninvited guest. More than that, these locks reveal something about their creators. They did not just fear theft, they expected it. They planned ahead, investing time and skill to protect what mattered, and in doing so, laid the foundation for centuries of innovation in security. So, next time you lock your door, remember you are continuing an ancient tradition driven by a simple truth: some things are worth protecting. The Egyptian wooden pin lock was more than the first known lock. It was the ancestor of nearly every pin tumbler lock in use today, simple, elegant, and effective. It protected temples, homes, and storerooms for centuries, all built from a few pieces of wood, clever design, and a deep need for privacy. Picture a large wooden door, not hinged like modern ones, but more like a vertical plank. Inside it, a wooden bolt slides horizontally to block entry. This bolt has holes with wooden pegs that fit into slots carved into the doorframe, stopping the bolt from moving. When locked, the bolt is held fast. The key, shaped somewhat like a modern toothbrush with pins matching the bolt's pegs, is inserted into the bolt. This lifts the pegs just enough to clear the slots, letting the bolt slide open. Remove the key and gravity drops the pins back, relocking the door. It's a mechanical memory without springs or gears, just wood, weight, and cleverness. What made it impressive was its balance of simplicity and reliability, easy to make with available materials, but difficult to bypass without the right key. And because each lock was hand-carved, keys weren't interchangeable. Your lock was unique. To you, these pin locks were not only for the wealthy or royalty. Archaeological finds at places like Nineveh and later Persian and Assyrian sites show the idea spread widely. Though Egypt invented the concept, it had broad reach. Beyond practical use, locks held symbolic meaning in tombs and sacred buildings. Locking something signified respect and finality, a belief that certain things should remain untouched except by those deserving the key. Security in ancient Egypt was not just functional, it was a statement. While Egypt gave us mechanical locks, ancient Mesopotamia developed a different security approach, one focused less on mechanics and more on identity. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, security was not secured by bolts, but by clay impressions. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians used cylinder seals, small carved stone rollers with unique images or inscriptions that were rolled over wet clay sealing containers, doors, or documents. This method worked like an ancient signature, wax seal, and barcode combined. Once impressed, the seal left a continuous pattern that was hard to duplicate. If someone tampered with the seal, breaking the clay, it was obvious. This was a simple but powerful approach. Instead of stopping access, it made unauthorized entry visible. It was a deterrent through transparency. These seals indicated authority and trust. High-ranking officials, merchants, and priests each had personalized seals, often passed down generations. The seals held such importance that some were buried with their owners as status symbols and tools for the afterlife. Mesopotamian security went beyond clay seals. Temple treasuries and granaries were secured with rope bindings, tied with intricate knots or seals that clearly showed tampering. The goal was to make the risk of being caught far worse than the potential reward. This idea of security as accountability, linking access to identity and social status, echoes through history. Even today, we log in with usernames, verify with signatures, and rely on records as much as locks. To the Mesopotamians, protecting something wasn't just about hiding it. It was a public declaration of who had the right to touch it. As ancient Greek city-states grew wealthier and more complex, their need for security increased, from temple treasuries to storerooms full of coins and private homes. The Greeks faced the same challenge, how to protect valuables when constant guarding wasn't possible. Surprisingly, they were slower than their Egyptian and Mesopotamian neighbors in mechanical lock development. Instead, they relied more on trust, social norms, and physical barriers, sometimes enhanced by simple but clever devices. One example is the bar and pin lock, used mostly for doors and chests. It consisted of a horizontal bar placed across the inside of a door, with a hole, through which a key could be inserted from outside to lift the bar. These keys were often large, flat iron rods, shaped like an F or P. They weren't discreet. In fact, some were nearly as long as a forearm, making it obvious the owner had something valuable. Keys and locks in Greek culture also carried symbolic weight. Being entrusted with a key represented authority and responsibility. In Homer's Odyssey, Penelope is described as holding the key to Odysseus's storeroom, a symbol of her power within the household. Greek locks had their limits. They were often crude, easily forced, and their security depended more on the key's physical size than on subtlety. What really kept valuables safe was a combination of concealment, guards, and social expectations. Temples and state treasuries were sealed with rope and wax, with multiple officials holding keys, so several had to be present to open a sacred store. Even homes were designed with layered security, multiple rooms, limited entry points, and gates barred from within. Wealthy households might employ slaves or guards to watch valuables, adding human protection to the simple mechanical locks. Though the Greeks admired cleverness, métier, cunning intelligence, they had not yet turned it fully to lockmaking, as later civilizations would. Still, they laid cultural foundations, keys as symbols of status, access as trust, and security as a balance between strength and social control. If the Egyptians gave us the pin lock concept and the Greeks infused trust into security traditions, it was the Romans who perfected lockmaking as a practical art. With their skill in metallurgy, obsession with order, and vast bureaucracy, the Romans brought precision, portability, and innovation to security systems, ideas that still influence locks today. Roman locks were primarily made of bronze and iron, allowed for much greater strength and the creation of smaller, more intricate designs compared to their wooden predecessors. They adapted the Egyptian pin tumbler concept, but miniaturized and refined it, sometimes even reinventing it entirely. Roman locksmiths developed warded locks, which used internal barriers or wards that only a correctly shaped key could navigate to turn and unlock the mechanism. This meant that simply inserting any tool wouldn't work. The key had to fit the internal layout precisely. Their keys themselves were remarkable, made from iron or bronze. Roman keys varied greatly in size, from large staff-like keys used for city gates to finely crafted ring keys worn like jewelry on the finger. These ring keys were not only elegant but practical, offering constant access to locked boxes or cabinets without carrying bulky tools, combining status and function in metal. However, the real innovation lay in Roman puzzle locks, complex mechanisms, concealed inside decorative boxes where pressing the wrong latch or turning at the wrong angle didn't just fail, but could lock the device even tighter. These were used not only to protect valuables, but also to hide documents, religious relics, or even poison, a favorite tactic in Roman political intrigue. Romans also institutionalized lock use widely. Banks, granaries, merchant chests, and military storerooms all relied on locks. Doors had metal plates, gates had locking bars, and even slaves could be restrained by iron collars, with keys held only by their masters. To Romans, a lock was more than a tool. It was a symbol of ownership, authority, and exclusion, and it helped establish the idea that a truly civilized society needed more than walls for protection. It required systems. While the West was developing intricate metal locks, ancient China took a different approach, blending practicality with philosophy. Chinese engineers, ever pragmatic, created locking systems that were simple, durable, and often symbolic. The most common ancient Chinese lock was the sliding bolt lock, usually made from bronze or iron. These locks consisted of a hollow metal case containing a sliding bolt secured by spring-loaded tumblers. When the right key, a flat, ridged metal stick, was inserted, the tumblers aligned, allowing the bolt to slide and the lock to open. This core principle behind the modern pin tumbler lock was already in use in Han Dynasty China as early as 200 BCE. Unlike Roman locks, which often featured external keyholes and decorative elements, Chinese locks were compact, discreet, and portable. Many secured chests, gates, jewelry boxes, and doors, focusing on function as much as form. Chinese locks were more than mechanical devices. They were often cast in animal shapes, tigers, dragons, turtles, or inscribed with symbols, representing luck, protection, or wealth. For example, a fish-shaped lock might secure a money box symbolizing abundance, while a dragon lock on a door served not only to protect but to warn intruders of a powerful guardian beyond. Locks also played ceremonial roles, such as during weddings, where love locks bound symbolic boxes or chests representing the couple's bond, and the key was handed over as a sign of trust and commitment. Some Chinese puzzle locks featured hidden mechanisms, false keyholes, or required specific sequences to open, not necessarily to make them harder to break, but to delay thieves, as even a short delay could prevent a successful theft. Chinese security. Culture emphasized harmony between utility, symbolism, and clever design. This blend created a quiet legacy, one that still influences subtle locks and symbolic rituals today. In ancient India, Security combined clever concealment, symbolic barriers, and layered protection, mixing spirituality with ingenuity. Indian locks weren't just meant to keep people out. They aimed to confuse, mislead, and warn. Secret latches, false compartments, and symbolic inscriptions elevated security into almost a philosophical practice. Puzzle locks and trick mechanisms were common, especially in temples and treasure chests, not to fully prevent forceful entry, but to complicate it enough to discourage attempts. Some locks required multiple actions, pressing hidden buttons, twisting levers before the key would turn. Others had decoy keyholes designed only to fool intruders, temples particularly showcased. Intricate security layers protecting gold, sacred texts, and revered relics. Instead of merely locking these items away, priests added ritual barriers, sealed wax, knotted ropes, and stamped clay emblems, each carrying spiritual significance. Breaking such seals was considered sacrilege, not just theft. Locks themselves often bore religious engravings, elephants, lotus flowers, deities, and protective mantras meant to intimidate and symbolize spiritual armor. Touching these locks without permission was, in many cases, an offense against the gods. In royal courts and merchant caravans, small portable locks secured scrolls, trade boxes, and private chambers. These were usually crafted from iron or brass, built to be lightweight yet durable. Keys were often highly individualized, with a single artisan crafting both lock and matching key to ensure security through obscurity. Like elsewhere in Asia, Indian locks sometimes held ceremonial roles in marriage or inheritance, where unlocking a sealed chest symbolized not just access to wealth, but the transfer of trust, legacy, and responsibility. For ancient India, the best lock didn't simply block access. It puzzled, protected, and silently declared, "Only the rightful may pass." As civilizations expanded and trade routes stretched from Rome to China, the need for portable security grew urgent. Locks had to guard more than temples or doors. They had to travel. Trade flourished. Silk from China moved westward. Spices flowed from India. Glassware, textiles, coins, and scrolls crisscrossed continents. With prosperity came risk. Bandits patrolled roads, dishonest porters pilfered goods, and valuables often changed hands without their owners present. The answer was locks that were compact, durable, and difficult to tamper with. Roman merchants commonly used small iron padlocks to secure chests, saddlebags, and warehouses. These had spring-loaded mechanisms and ring keys sturdy enough to resist casual theft, but light enough for travel. Such locks have been found from Britain to Syria, in ruins or shipwrecks, showing a universal concern for protecting portable wealth. Chinese traders and officials used portable sliding locks, often bronze, attached to chests or carts. Some were cleverly disguised, ornamental or embedded in the boxes, frequently engraved with ownership marks. Breaking these locks was both a crime and a dishonor. Nomadic peoples in Central Asia developed leather and metal clasp systems, using metal rings and latches over tents, horse packs, and weapon cases. These were less complex, but prioritized speed and visibility. A traveler could instantly tell if their goods had been disturbed. On battlefields, locks secured weapon caches, treasury wagons, and command tents. Controlling access was critical, not just to resources, but to information. Scrolls and maps were often locked in boxes, requiring multiple officers to open them, an early form of two-factor authorization. Across cultures, one truth remained. The more mobile the world became, the more ingenious locks had to be. The road brought opportunity but also danger, and ancient travelers met it not only with swords but with keys. When we twist a key today or enter a code, we rarely consider the thousands of years of quiet invention behind that simple act. Each click, latch, or password connects us to a story beginning in Egyptian temples, Roman workshops, and the silent trade routes that linked the ancient world. The legacy of ancient locks is not only mechanical, but psychological. These early devices reflect a fundamental human desire to protect, exclude, and define what belongs to us. Whether a wooden bolt in Thieves, a ring key in Pompeii, or a puzzle lock in Chang'an, the concept remained: to create a boundary only the rightful person could cross. Over time, these boundaries became more than physical barriers. They became symbols. A temple lock didn't just protect gold, it preserved the sacred. A sealed scroll didn't just hide knowledge, it marked power. Even today, locks mark trust. A locked diary, a wedding chest, a secure vault. Though mechanisms have advanced, the meaning endures. Remarkably, modern pin tumbler locks still mirror Egyptian designs, and today's privacy seals, passcodes, and blockchain security echo ancient ideas of personal access, tamper resistance, and symbolic control. There is also a philosophical aspect. Ancient locks were never foolproof. They could be picked, broken, or bypassed, just like now. But their strength lay not only in denying entry, but in declaring boundaries, telling the world, "This is mine, you do not have permission." This psychological boundary, more than any mechanical part, defines security. From tombs to trade routes, temples to homes, locks have always been about more than preventing theft. They represent control, identity, secrecy, and sometimes survival. So next time you slide a deadbolt or hear a safe click shut, remember, you are not just using a tool, you are continuing a story written by kings, merchants, warriors, and priests, each trusting a small piece of technology to hold back the world.